Schedule. Welcome to today's webinar. We are covering security and compliance in AI. Thank you for joining us this morning. I wanted to let everybody know that we have an AI organizational risk assessment that will be available for everyone today following today's webinar. If you've registered for the webinar, then we will be emailing this to you in the next day. I would also like to remind everyone to follow us on LinkedIn. We have our LinkedIn link there for you to see. We are also celebrating 10 years of Ostendio this year, and we have VIP access to our resources. The information in order to register is also available on our LinkedIn page. So let's get started. Welcome to the webinar today. I just want to cover a little bit of housekeeping. My name is Miranda Elliott. I'm the Digital Marketing Manager here at Ostendio. I want to let you know that this session is being recorded. All attendees are on mute. And if you'd like to ask questions, either on the Zoom or on LinkedIn Live, then we welcome your questions. We think this is a great opportunity to have a discussion about security and compliance in AI. So please use that feature. We'll probably hold the questions until the end of the webinar, but we look forward to hearing from you. I am very happy to introduce you to our speakers this morning. Our guest speaker, welcome, is Jonathan Dambrot from Cranium. He's the CEO of Cranium. Jonathan is a co-founder also of Cranium, which is the leading AI security and trust platform that spun out of the KPMG studio in April of this year. With over 20 years of experience in information technology, cybersecurity, and third-party risk management, Jonathan is a visionary and industry leader who drives confidence and trust in the use of secure artificial intelligence. And we're very happy to have him joining us this morning. Morning, Jonathan.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Good stuff. And I will also introduce you to our host today. Grant Elliott is the CEO of Ostendio. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Ostendio, Ostendio is a platform, an industry-leading, platform, collaborative integrated risk management and SaaS platform. Ostendio works with hundreds of companies and thousands of users to build security programs that are audit ready for complex audits such as SOC 2, HITRUST, FedRAMP, and HIPAA. I'm getting a bit tongue-tied this morning. Grant is a thought leader in enterprise cybersecurity and speaks regularly about how organizations can implement effective cybersecurity and risk management programs. And he is also regularly our host for these webinars. So I'm happy to hand it over now to Grant and get started. And Grant, we can't hear you just now, sorry.
We're doing the same thing. There you go. Thank you very much, Miranda. I really appreciate the introduction. Jonathan, it's so good to have you here. I know we've known each other for a few years now, and I'm really excited to have the opportunity to kind of dig into this conversation. Miranda gave a little bit of background, but, you know, I mean, you've had a number of iterations in your career. First of all, tell me about you. What's your personal history, right? You know, what got you to this point?
Yeah, so Grant, it's great to see you. Thank you for the invite to come on through your webinar here. So, yeah, so my background, I am now the CEO of Cranium, but prior to that, I was a partner at KPMG in the cyber practice, focused on a couple of key areas. So first, I ran third-party security as a service globally. And in addition to that, helped stand up AI security services as well as incubated Cranium. And we'll talk a little bit about the story of that because it's a fun one and it's sort of like a, you know, Shark Tank moment for me to pitch a big four firm on an innovation concept to spin out a company. And fortunately, the firm was extraordinarily supportive in that effort. You know, I spent about 4 years at KPMG. Prior to that, I ran a software company called Prevalent, which we had built into one of the leaders in third-party risk management and threat intelligence. I ended up selling that business to a private equity firm in New York prior to joining KPMG. So it's been a fun ride. We've definitely seen a lot of hydration around, the continued use of AI and how important this has now become. And it's changing so radically and so quickly, but we've been able to really look at this historically and really seen these trends, fortunately, a few years ago, and we're able to kind of develop Cranium to help support that.
So I always like to ask, right, when you take yourself back to your kind of 16, 17-year-old self, right, what did you envisage you would be doing, and how does that compare, obviously, to kind of the journey you've been on since?
So Grant, I think what you're hinting at, if I'm not mistaken, so when I was in high school, I was also an entrepreneur. I had a magic company where I manufactured 3 magic tricks. I also performed every weekend. So that's how I paid for college. And I had distributors. I sent these magic tricks. So in Boston, I don't even think it's there anymore. There was one called Hank Lee's. In California, it was the Sorcerer's Shop. In New York, it was Tannen's Magic, and we distributed our magic tricks that way, and then performed. Paid for my first car and college that way. And I honestly, I was one of those kids. I knew I probably wasn't going to be a magician my whole life, but to be totally honest, I had no idea what my career path was. I probably could have told you then. I like being an entrepreneur, but to be honest, I really loved being a partner at KPMG too. I found that very entrepreneurial, which is kind of interesting. Some people would look at that differently than I did. But yeah, I think definitely, being able to build something, continue to build, see it successful in a market, that's always been super exciting and interesting to me.
So, well, let me see if I can do a good segue from that, because again, a lot of people would probably consider AI to be like magic, but we're going to spend some time here basically unmasking the logic behind that. Let's talk a little bit more about Cranium. You mentioned, how it came about, and you talked about the kind of the KPMG angle. So, I know that from previous conversations, this is an idea you'd had for a while, and it was something that you had to persuade KPMG to kind of go down this route. Explain what drove you. Why was AI the area that you wanted to go from after Prevalent? And just how much of a task was it? Because KPMG is a large organization. I know they're a pretty creative organization as well, but trying to spin out innovation from large organizations isn't easy.
Yeah, certainly. And it's so exciting to be part of it, but it also, it's nerve-wracking, right? And there's some scars there. So, when I started at KPMG, coming off the back of Prevalent, one of the things that we recognized was that there were certain aspects of third-party security and third-party risk that, we just weren't able to solve for. And no matter what we did in kind of the workflow capabilities, it just wasn't getting solved. And so we started developing something there. It sounded really unique at the time. Today, I'm not sure it's so unique, but we ended up calling it Casey, and it was a chat environment where we were front-ending it with Rasa and a couple of other tools. And on the back end, we had built, call it about 16 different core models to support different use cases. And some of which were, NLP driven to read contracts and revisions and security addendums. Some of it was ask me anything from a process perspective, and some were focused on using data kind of internally and externally for organizations that were kind of stuck, right, where they were trying to do thousands. They may have, like one of our clients had 50,000 vendors, and they may be getting stuck just in like about 1,000 a year, both from an inherent risk and an assessment perspective. And so we used the models to start getting, driving through that. And in one case, we were able to actually execute 50,000 inherent risk assessments daily, right? And striping across procurement data and all these, and using those correlations to help drive improvements. What we found, though, was that we were taking really sensitive data. We were putting them into models that we were building. And, KPMG has a very large data science team that focuses on the development of these things. And we were putting them into production, and we were making real-time decisions about these supply chains. And missing from that equation was any security conversation. And so it was like amazing to me because we were doing all of this work. And then, so I started kind of asking simple questions like, what are we doing to secure these systems adversarially? And the answers that I got back were frankly horrible. And I just couldn't believe like what's going on. And so started talking to our clients about that. And sure enough, like we started working with very large financial, large pharmaceutical, large CPG clients, and they said the same thing. Like we have model risk management in one area of our business, in the risk business, but cyber's not really part of that. And in fact, we met, after we had pitched Cranium and incubated, we've been meeting, in that incubation process with about 100 different CISOs. We couldn't find a single one that had a mechanism to understand the data science environment, the AI systems, both enterprise and generative, and could monitor against some of these threats to meet their obligations. So that really was what, kind of started incubating in my mind the idea for Cranium. And then we had the opportunity ultimately to pitch the firm. And this was very Shark Tank, right? Like, I'm not going to say who Mr. Wonderful was, but we definitely had a Mr. Wonderful who ended up being great, and he was very supportive. But there was a group of people that were responsible for, both enterprise innovation as well as advisory. And AI is pretty ubiquitous at KPMG. And I pitched them. And then within 3 days, I got an answer back, and they were very, very supportive. They gave me money to build the MVP, and they said, go build your team, go build it out. And we built it specifically as a business, a software platform and a business to spin out. It was very cool. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's interesting. I read an analyst report recently, and it said that, despite the reduction in capital available in the market today, that the two areas that are still receiving, pretty sizable investments are AI and security. I think it's interesting, based on your description, that you can have those two investment areas, because I think the challenge that we've both seen is that they don't really go together very well. I mean, one of the things I've noticed, certainly over the 10 years I've been doing this, is that there's lots of money from the West Coast, from various different VC firms that get invested in lots of different organizations across all different technologies, with very little focus around the security. We saw the issues with Zoom when the pandemic started, and all of a sudden you have this company that was just growing exponentially and then having serious flaws around their kind of security architecture. Let's talk a little bit about, we're seeing more AI startups today than anything else that's been built in the US, right? And with the way that you can start a business today, literally, anyone and their brother can basically get some server power and basically create an AI startup. I want to dig into why AI, more than any other technology we've developed before, has fundamental security flaws built into it, and why it's necessary by design to build security in at the beginning. Do you want to just expand a little bit? I mean, maybe we talk a little bit more about the different types of AI and why AI itself is inherently insecure.
Yeah, I would look at this. So let's go back to the investment question for 1 second. So talking about the security, I do think it's important. So, we ended up getting our Series seed round funded by Sin Ventures. So they came in, they helped us spin the business out. So KPMG and Sin Ventures ended up doing the round. And we'll have some announcements coming out soon around some additional funding as well. And, what's interesting is I've spoken to a lot of investors about what they've invested in the last 5 years. And for serious software investors, I think for the most part, I haven't seen an investor that hasn't invested in an AI company or a technology that doesn't have AI in it in the last 3 years. It's been literally 100% of their investments have been AI specific. They've either included it or they've been AI companies or Gen AI companies. So I think that's a natural progression. Now we're just seeing the impact of all of that coming through the pipe in that time frame. So, I think there's part of it where there's been so much experimentation. We've gone from like a linear growth curve with AI to an exponential curve now that generative AI has really started to come into organizations and be used and adopted very widely, both from a consumer perspective and an enterprise. And I think when you start seeing that level of adoption where security hasn't had oversight, historically, you've either thought it didn't really existed, like it's not real, or from a prioritization perspective, they've prioritized other things historically, like ransomware and identity and other areas. I think that's what we're seeing, right? So it's the combination of massive levels of investment competitively, lack of oversight potentially in an area which has very sensitive data, where the models themselves are intended to change. And we're not building completely recursive systems yet, right? Where they're managed independently, but we're getting there, right? You're already seeing some of that with like auto GPT and some of the indications that, code development is one of the core use cases. So you're going to start seeing these things, almost prompt themselves and build themselves, and improve rapidly. You're seeing that level of improvement quickly. So I wouldn't say it's just, the insecurity is necessarily independent of all these things. I think you're seeing the impact of the investment, the fact that there hasn't been a structure built to date to really manage a non-CI/CD based environment that's intended to change and learn over time. And you're starting to see that enterprise model where you had ML ops environments, and you had a group of data scientists that were building models, potentially smaller models, now with large language models and generative AI, and these things seem to be colliding pretty rapidly. And so I think though these risks, the lexicon of these are also different. People just haven't been as aware. And so again, it's all of these factors and coming to play.
Yeah, I mean, I think where I'm coming from is that, look, it still amazes me that Chat GPT is less than 11 months old, right? When we think about just how much has changed, and and this move toward generative AI really has accelerated. People have been talking about AI for years, right? And so it's not that the concept of AI hasn't been here. It's basically just how far it's moved forward in such, what was it, a short period of time. I mean, I can't remember the specific numbers, but ChatGPT's got more subscriptions by far than any other technology application in such a short period of time.
Like 100 million users, the fastest application to 100 million users or something, right?
And it's still only 11 months old, right? And I went to a few events this year and walked away from this. Suddenly had this realization to the point when I came back into the company in the summer. I actually realized that, we as an organization were already behind the curve, right? If you've got people who think it's cheating to use ChatGPT, if you've got people who think that AI is somehow a shortcut or being lazy, if you're not realizing just the impact that AI is going to have in your business, and probably is already having in your business that you don't even realize, right? Then, and this is, I think, the kind of challenge that I think that businesses have to face right now. On one hand, we should always adopt technology at a pace where we can basically ensure that it's not going to be disruptive and it's not going to make us insecure. And we're going to I want to talk a little bit about the structure of AI in a second for why that is something we have to be cautious about. But the other side of that is if you don't adopt it fast enough, other people are going to adopt it. And this technology has so many advantages and so many capabilities that can basically improve the efficiency of your business that if you're the last one to adopt, you're basically going to be too late. How are you seeing from your perspective the clients you're seeing when you're talking to them? It almost seems like a gorge fest of we need to take advantage of this, and it's running really without looking, which is really the kind of the area that you're trying to focus on.
Yeah, and so I think there's some differences depending on what kind of organization you are, whether you're highly regulated, whether you're in industries that are building kind of sensitive AI systems. But yeah, I mean, look, I think it's become apparent that the use of AI is going to become a competitive advantage. And as it becomes more ubiquitous, I wonder whether that will remain. But we are on an exponential curve, here for the use and the adoption of AI. When we look at those companies that have invested historically, in some cases, they're way better prepared because they at least know how these systems operate. They've been using them in production in many cases. But we're starting to see, again, a lot of those investments. So if we saw out of 100 models that were developed inside of a large enterprise, maybe 20% of them going into production, now there's an expectation that we're going to see most of them go into production, right? And from a generative perspective, a lot of organizations, especially regulated organizations, have gone through this cycle where, okay, let's open up ChatGPT. Okay, we can't use the commercial one. Let's use the API, or we can't use the consumer one. Let's use the API. Let's try to drive that. Oh, well, that doesn't really help us meet our obligations either. Let's use Azure OpenAI as an example. And, let's work on fine tuning. Oh, well, that's not really, helping us completely. Let's do vector embeddings. So there's a lot of this experimentation going through. And so it's happening in real time, and people now have different risks and considerations as they're going through the process of trying to bring these LLMs into an environment that they can get better control over their data, understand when those data changes are happening, depending on what models they're using, understand when those models are coming in, whether they're vulnerable, how to make sure that they have a mechanism to monitor those over time, understand the data going in and out, and whether or not, again, they're meeting the obligations as a company. You've seen some things hit where, organizations have inadvertently used these technologies already. In some cases, in the legal context, where they develop briefs and they put those briefs in the court system without oversight. So you've seen that, and the censor that the fundamental inaccurate information that's been generated, right? So if you ask these generative systems to create something, it'll create it, right? It's not going to stop it. Whether it's accurate or not, or whether it is going to meet the requirements is up to the author or the prompter. And then on the flip side of that, how do you make sure that you're also not, creating pressure from an innovation perspective? So you saw Samsung as a good example, where they potentially lost patentability because they were trying to use these systems and do it. So how do you do that in a way that you mitigate those risks? How do you understand what systems are there? How do you put those guardrails in? And those are some of the things that we've been absolutely working towards and building.
So I guess the question then becomes, because again, and maybe that needs to be a little bit of a kind of, for people out there to understand the difference between the different types of AI systems. I read a study recently where they did a kind of financial analysis between Bloomberg AI and I think it was some sort of open AI based off ChatGPT, and they were trying to do financial analysis. And you would think that Bloomberg AI would give better, more predictable results, but in the end, actually, it was the public API solution that actually did. And so the reason I kind of bring this up is because I think people, the whole concept of an AI learning model is it requires data to learn, right? And the more data you put in, the more sophisticated the learning model becomes. But we're still at the point, even though we're seeing so much progress, where the bigger the learning model is, even if it's more generic, it still tends to be more effective, right? And it's certainly that's the kind of less they come out. The challenge I think that poses that when you start looking at trying to build an effective AI capability, organizations are going to make decisions based on the one that's most effective, not necessarily the most secure, right? And understanding that potentially means not just, and we've not even talked about hosting right now, just the fact that they need to take that data and basically put it into a broad supply. Now, ethical AI companies have mechanisms to make sure that data is maintained and protected. They have outlines of how they're going to manage it from a privacy perspective. But the challenge we have, as we've just talked about, there are literally thousands of these organizations out there. Not everyone's going to use Azure AI. And even if they do, the way they design the learning model and the privacy practices are theirs, not necessarily. So I guess I'm kind of opening the door for you, because this is basically what you guys are doing. You guys are going to come into organizations and try and understand what AI risk they have. How do they identify where the AI risk is, and help them try and identify how they basically lock down that risk. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think we look at it in kind of like four key areas, right? So first of all, up until this year, there was no mechanism. This conversation didn't even exist fundamentally from a cyber perspective. It wasn't that interesting. And even when you look at the CISO forums where people were coming in, so it was maybe it hit the top 10 from a priority perspective, but probably not, right? And then this year, it is the only conversation. So part of this is, how do you address and answer those questions that are coming from your board, from your clients now? So we've seen, some of our large banking customers modifying their contracts at this point to make sure that they understand through their supply chain, are you using AI in the delivery of products and service to us? and that we have dependencies on, so that they can start to understand that. And then how do they even look at that? So it's really internally, how do we get visibility? How do we understand the AI systems, both enterprise and generative, in use? If I'm a security professional and I'm a CISO, how do we understand and start to learn about those adversarial threats? So things like data poisoning, backdoor detection, model theft, model evasion, and a set of others, right? So, you've seen some good guidance, and we work closely with MITRE, but, MITRE Atlas is a good example, has a set of those threats that they've identified in mitigations. And we really like that team. They're doing tremendous work. You see the NIST AI risk management framework, which is continuously getting updated now, and driving more of the generative pieces into that as well, to really think about this more broadly around some of the other areas from a responsibility perspective. And so you're starting to see those things starting to come into the lexicon. But again, up until this year, it really wasn't part of the conversation at all. So now, you got visibility, and now you've got to think about the monitoring, and then the pieces that are coming as people are trying to get prepared for this, as the EU AI Act and other things, other regulations start to hit and take hold, is the compliance, and then ultimately the supply chain and third-party pieces, because there are some industries that will never have data scientists, right? They're completely dependent upon the third-party services as they come into their organizations. I think legal is one of those industries that are pretty much like that. And they're using AI in very unique ways to get leverage for their associates and their attorneys. But that's some of the most sensitive data that's going downstream from, banks and other customers, right?
Isn't one of the challenges, though? I mean, we've just talked about, look, all these technologies have a life cycle. We understand they can early adoption life cycle, but the challenge we're having here is this transition is happening so fast, right? The question I think that, when I speak to organizations today is, there's this perception that AI is coming, not that it's here. There's this perception that AI is something they choose to use, something that they might not already be used. We talked the other day about shadow AI, right? Organizations today don't realize that A, their employees are using this without them even know. B, their suppliers are embedding this without them even knowing. So even if you as an organization make a conscious decision that we're not going to proactively pursue the use of AI, it's here. It's already in their organizations without them even doing it. How do they get to grips with that?
Yeah, so invariably this conversation goes to regulation, right? Who's going to regulate this? Is it getting regulated? Who's going to understand this, and how do I manage that? I think obviously that's getting that's happening today. A lot of the regulations are happening both at a national level, from a security perspective. Singapore has like an AI security law that's now on the books. You look at the US, there's some statewide regulations, and then there's the White House AI Bill of Rights, and the NIST AI Risk Management Framework as a framework specifically. The EU AI Act, I think, is going to take, is going to drive some leadership, but Canada and Australia. So I think that the problem with all of these is that it's going slower than the experimentation that's happening in the field, right? So how do you address questions? Like, we had a situation where we had a client who had medical devices that was pulling information from the surgical arena. That information was going through a de-identification process that was then getting pushed into another model. And in their case, it was interesting because they were doing the right thing, but some of the requirements that were coming down from, their regulators were saying that the AI system needed to fail open to a human. And the problem with that was that the data that was coming across, the PHI and the PII information coming from the surgical arena that was then getting fed back to surgeons, if humans were in the loop, it became effectively illegal for that person to view them. So these are some of the questions that I just don't like. People have not had to address, right? Like, so how do you think about that?
And it's going to take, it's going to take a long, in the same way that I think that Silicon Valley is too open. I think you tend to find that legal and regulatory are too closed. And this is dynamic. Like, I'm old enough to remember when the internet first came in, and I remember the dynamic around public versus private networks. And then obviously we evolved to a cloud environment. I many years ago set up the Healthcare Cloud Coalition, where we worked with the Office for Civil Rights on giving guidance around regulation of healthcare data within the cloud. That process, if you think about going back to the early days of the internet, took 20 years, right, to really evolve appropriate. I mean, and there's an argument, we're still arguing over that right now, right? You look
And
at
it's
how
still
long
going,
it took
it's still going so
right?
fast, right? Yeah.
You look how long it took to regulate, cloud to the point where large organizations actually started feeling comfortable. I mean, people that are old enough will remember, like, 15 years ago, organizations would say they would never put their data in the cloud, right? It was all going to be private servers, right?
Yeah.
My point here is that we've literally taken over that in the period of a year. And so I don't think you can't wait for regulation to be, if you're not conducting an assessment today on your business around what your current AI situation is, if you're not setting yourself AI objectives just now, you are at the mercy of the environment you're sitting in.
Yeah, and that's what we saw. That's what we started seeing a couple of years ago as we started the incubation process. Even though organizations hadn't prioritized it, it was clear that we were about to bump into this, and it's only going faster than we thought. So to your point, it's getting integrated into everything, every tool, every capability, every Microsoft application, and so, how do you manage in that environment where you may not have visibility into those systems? And so
or maybe not even have a choice. I mean, I think this is the point. If you're using a major CRM platform or some sort of major tool that you have, which is core to your business, and they suddenly just start adopting AI within that capability, you might not even have a choice to basically, because you might not even know, right, that they're doing that, because if they're not transparent about it, because the regulations aren't making it. And that's the challenge I think organizations have as well.
Yeah, so I think that's what people are preparing for. So like looking at ultimately building what's defined as a critical AI system in the future will require that level of transparency reporting, similar to almost the way that GDPR with cookie management worked, right? So we built something called Cranium AI card, right? So this was an intent to drive in light of that requirement coming up to meet those standards. So in the EU AI Act, they point to like a CAP AI standard, which details what's required inside of inside of that card, so that you can understand not only the security and the safety, but also, fundamentally the values of the organization managing and developing those systems, so that you can decide whether or not you want to use them. I think that will start to become more pervasive. I think there's certain organizations that are getting ahead of the curve. I think some aren't, and will be forced to do that. But yes, I think that's probably going to take a little bit more time.
Yeah, I'd also say as well for people listening there, a lot of the standard information security frameworks actually cover the basics of this. And the reason I can say this is because if you think about it, right, if you're a company that's building a new AI model, you have to store your learning model somewhere, right? When you're ingesting the data that learning model is using, you're storing it somewhere. The question you have to ask that provider is, where are they storing it, right? Again, there's nothing that mandates an organization to store their data in a secure environment. Even if they're putting in AWS, even if they're putting in Azure, their credential access. I mean, the reason that we started working together recently is because obviously you're aware of the risk challenges of the security challenge of your organization. So again, working with us to help make sure that you as an organization have an effective security program in place. Talk about that decision. What made you think about, this is more than providing a technology. We have to kind of, not just walk the walk, but talk the talk. We have to walk the walk.
Yeah. So look, I mean, I don't think what I would ever say is that a lot of the core practices that have been created for application security, network security, those core principles that are required to meet our SOC 2 obligations, like we still need all of those. And, whether or not we could argue about the 3 lines of defense, whether or not that's, working at scale. But I do think, look, the fundamentals are still the fundamentals. And I think those are absolutely applicable. And, we use Ostendio to help support, and manage our processes so that, we can go through and get our SOC 2. So please, when I'm talking about these new threats and these risks, it's not intended at all to say that it's only those things. But I do think that there's a set of new risks and threats that are coming, that are here and are coming, that I don't think people have been prepared for, especially in systems, again, not intended to change. And in some cases, that have not necessarily even been in the corporate infrastructure, have been in these AI environments that have been inside the business historically. So I think the CIOs and the CISOs that are now trying to get their arms around it or struggling a bit. You mentioned shadow AI. I think that's obviously a problem. The supply chain components are a problem. And then I think really understanding and learning what these new threats to the systems look like we built out the threat model for one of the largest pharmaceutical businesses in the world. And these environments were so big and they were so diverse in terms of their tooling, the toolkits, the models, the data sets, the types of use cases that they were trying to solve, and the scale of the user communities, that there wasn't a mechanism to really get your arms around it meaningfully and really understand those changes that were happening, even though, again, the sensitivity of these things was extraordinary. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's just a new world in that regard, but you always have to, I think you always have to do the basics right.
So we've talked a lot about the kind of security aspect, and I think that kind of bleeds into privacy around the concept of how and Europe definitely is ahead of the US in terms of kind of having more robust privacy frameworks and regulations around where your data is going. But you also mentioned earlier on things like data poisoning. We talk about the kind of ethical considerations. Can you expand on some of those things a little bit more?
Yeah. So when we started really looking at the problem, the data privacy pieces are definitely front and center here. People are concerned not only about the data that are going into these models to train them, but ultimately whether or not, the data that they're putting in to drive the generation, let's say, against these models. So the generation of output is being used to further train those models in a public LLM, like in a public way, so that how dependable is that privacy. And so I think it's both internal and external. Fundamentally it's difficult because putting boundaries around what a pipeline looks like for an AI system is difficult today, especially if you're using some of those APIs. So I think there's going to be a lot of work in understanding the current privacy regulations and the impact from an AI perspective. And the EU AI Act, I think, expands upon that further. And I think when you look forward, it's going to, we're going to have to think about the technologies that are going to support things like unlearning, right? So we've worked with researchers that have done a lot of research on, as an example, right to be forgotten. And in a simple way, the right to be forgotten, when you're not using it inside of a large model, it's easier, right? It's potentially permission-based. It's in a database, you know where it is. It may be feeding multiple systems, but you potentially have a mechanism in place to understand the use of that data and then how to manage it and prosecute, a right to be forgotten request. And in a learning system, it becomes more difficult. The unlearning that has to happen there, there's been some research to show that mechanism itself could create security vulnerabilities inside those models. So how do we do that effectively? How do we even know that that's been done? And so those are some of the roles that I think we can play.
Yeah, look, I think it gets into really interesting kind of legal territory, right? We've already had lots of debate for many years about the concept of data ownership, right? And how can you actually own something that is replicated? So it really is kind of more of a kind of data rights. But what AI does, from my perspective, it then extends that definition to what is the definition of data? We have historical definitions of PII. We have historical definitions of what is proprietary yours. But when learning comes off of you, right? And when a model is driven off of your data, right? How much of that data do you own versus someone else owns? If the algorithm wasn't there, if the learning wasn't there, maybe the data, and some of these things have been debated before as well, but this whole concept of what data is yours, what data is to be deleted becomes really, really complicated.
Oh, totally. And you're seeing artists who are suing now, OpenAI and other providers of these technologies to say, look, I do not want my data to be used in these processes. I don't want my likeness where people are creating videos or, even written words around the books that it's learned on, as an example. So yeah, this is all getting prosecuted right now. I think the next year is going to be super interesting to watch all of this come together and see what is actually available. I mean, even over the last couple of weeks, you've seen the move to a multimodal capability coming out of some of the generative systems where, it's the combination of how do I use video or a picture, and then how does that convert to a more conversational capability? And so that is, I think, going to have a profound impact moving forward. And then, what is the implication if artists actually can remove themselves from these models, and how, and the creative exercises that these, and what's available on the internet, how do you stop it if it's learning from the internet itself?
Yeah, look, I'm an optimist. I love technology. I love what technology does. I understand that any new technology has ways it can be used, for the good, and ways it can be used for not so good as well. But look, give me your kind of perspective. I dread to say 5 years time, because again, I mentioned earlier on that we're only 11 months in with ChatGPT, but with the advances we're making in quantum computing, because there's an argument that the limitations we experience in AI today is literally just down to processing power, right? And as we're kind of continuing to evolve in that state as well, I mean, what's your kind of, where are we in 5 years time with AI?
Yeah, you mentioned some interesting things. I mean, quantum AI security is one of the areas we're investigating. I think you're already seeing some requirements for people to become prepared for a quantum ready world, right? Like, if you believe that people are collecting encrypted information today, let's say, that have a shelf life that, is within a span where they believe they'll be able to use that effectively to decrypt. I mean, these are all interesting questions. Looking 5 years out is tough right now when we're seeing exponential growth of these technologies and the impact of these changes that we're seeing within months or weeks. It feels like days now, fundamentally changing the landscape of how they can be used to solve real big problems. But I do think that we're going to see the solving of problems we couldn't even imagine, even just a couple of years ago. I think quantum is one of them. To support, some of these additional large language models. I wonder how big these models can continue to get. You're seeing, again, exponential growth in the models now coming out of China, where, they're multiple times the size of the current LLMs, even OpenAI and ChatGPT, right? So these are super interesting to see the impact of that in the real world. I'm not exactly, it's a little bit tough to answer. I do think you mentioned magic before. There will be certain things that feel like that, but I think even more fundamentally, we need to have a mechanism to train people for this new world. We need to have people who understand how to use these tools. In some cases, we need to have way more people who can build in these environments, but also who understand fundamentally how they can be used to get more productivity. We have an ROI problem in AI. They're very expensive in many cases. We're like driving Ferraris, we're building Ferraris for Yugo-based problems in some cases. And I think we need to start thinking about it. In a lot of cases, I think we're going to move to much smaller models that are going to be, chained together and built into, you're starting to see some of that with Bedrock. I think you're seeing like Anthropic is a good example, building capabilities to build a constitution into the AI system. So, exactly kind of how it's more transparent to start and how you want it to work. And then, being able to do that. So it's not clear exactly who, what the winners will completely be. I think you're seeing all the big players are making their bets, and we're seeing the impact of that. But these are certainly be interesting things as they come forward.
Well, look, I mean, I could definitely talk about this all day for sure. And we've not even touched on the concept of things like, bias and stuff like that. There's so many other areas that we can get into. Let's finish up with, if you were to advise the business leaders today, right, on, how they face the challenges of AI, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, so there's like 2 or 3 things that I think you need to start thinking about today, right? So regardless of whether you're developing your own models or you have your own MLOps or you're bringing in third parties, I think having a group that's dedicated to govern AI in your environment with dedicated roles. Today, we're seeing those groups get formed for AI governance. I think 50% of the time we're seeing the CISO organization taking an ownership role in that, just because of the operational requirements and the questions that are coming back around data usage and security and those things. 50% of the time, it's generally others, right? The CDO, the head of AI, maybe, compliance or legal. And I think building out a framework to help understand, what are the use cases? How do you understand the requirements technically and from a data perspective? How do you ensure that the guardrails are there and that, you can answer those fundamental questions are super important. And then having a mechanism to drive visibility into those environments and understand when things are changing. So being able to answer questions around when data is getting updated, when models are getting updated, when they're going against high risk and they become high risk and high profile to meet those other obligations, I think is going to be a core fundamental requirement of the things that are going to happen over the next 12 months to get prepared. So those are generally things that I recommend highly today. I think people have started to write some of their policies around this. And I think they have to kind of stay flexible as these things change pretty radically. So, keep them updated through that same governance structure.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely add to that. I'd recommend two things. I mean, I think as an organization, if you've not done an assessment of your organization on the use or intended use of AI within your organization, you need to do that today. Because I guarantee you, every organization is going to be surprised by just how much AI exists within their organization already. I think the second, and I say this to every single individual, use it. If you're not going in and using ChatGPT, if you're not going in and using some sort of AI capability, you're not going to understand it. And I mean, understand it in terms of both what it can and what it can't do, right? Because it has significant limitations as well at this point. And there's always going to be some form of limitation, with anything that's designed by humans. But it's getting better all the time. And I think that people are not really going to appreciate it unless they're using it personally as well. So I think people have to start getting in using generative AI, to start into using tools that can leverage UI so they can see the power, what it can do and what it can't do. But fundamentally, if you're a business leader today and you don't understand today the how much AI is being used within your business today, then I think you've been irresponsible because it's there, and you might not know how to deal with it. You might have to be calling you up, Jonathan, right, to say, hey, listen, we've got way more AI within our business than we think. How do we manage that? But organizations can start, and I think to that end, I think we've got an assessment we're kind of giving away as part of this. Jonathan, thank you. I really appreciate it. I think we might have some questions. Miranda.
Hi there. Yes, we've actually had a lot of questions coming in during the conversation. So what I'm going to try and do is paraphrase them in order to answer them in the next 10 minutes. So one of the main themes that people have been asking about is, when should I be worried about the use of AI in my organization, and how do I control unvetted tools?
I'm going to quickly start with that, then I'm going to throw over to Jonathan. Yesterday is going to be the answer as to when, as I think, as I just said, if you're not understanding it today, you're already behind the curve. I think the first tool, as I said, is basically to do an assessment, but Jonathan can talk about other tools that they can provide.
Yeah, so I think that there's a couple of mechanisms there to, I agree with Grant, when you should be worried. I guess time's past. It's not about the worry so much as it's understanding what to be worried about, right? So when we think about the third party piece, we've been working with, we did some work with the GRF recently to help support a practitioner guide for AI security and a leadership guide for AI security. And as part of that, Shared Assessments is doing some work on the definition of some of the key questions, to think about as part of the SIG. I think a lot of that is, still very manual, right? So we need to get to a point where we can automate the discovery, automate the compliance activities here. So those are some of the things that I think, you need to start thinking about, especially as you're developing and pushing those to your users, consuming them, or building them into your products. And those are some of the things that we've been building, but, thinking about. And if there's more questions around that, again, Grant, I try not to make this too much of a sales pitch. If people are interested in seeing how we think about, a vendor and how they can use a mechanism to give you that visibility without actually giving you access to data and models, but provide that bill of materials up, we can certainly share that.
We have someone who's asking about their struggle with AI false positives and configuring for those. Can the self-healing of false positives be trusted, or do these still need engineers to evaluate and tell the AI to handle these differently?
So self-healing AI is one of the other research areas that we're highly interested in. So unlearning and self-healing are definitely areas that we're going to have to deal with, especially again, as these things become recursive, right? I don't think, I think right now, these are all human-driven activities and will be for a while. So Grant, you mentioned bias, right? Bias becomes one of those things that is more of a legal construct. False positives, I'd love to dig in a little bit further in understanding what false positives specifically are they talking about, security false positives for looking at things like data poisoning, et cetera, or are they thinking about false positives for outputs in the model and that are weighted incorrectly? But I think generally these are things that today, are generally human driven, but in the near future are going to be more driven by machine. Yeah.
Yeah, I just can add, I think at the end of the day, you've got to try and build a trust model based on experience. For me, AI will be there when Amazon actually predicts what I want to buy next, rather than some of the stuff that it predicts for me, right? And I kind of feel that they're spending a huge amount of money on this as well. Look, I make the point of using AI a lot. And for me, it's all about, trying to make sure the prompts and the guidance is as accurate as possible. But then you just have to observe over a period of time, because nothing's ever going to be 100%, right? And so you make your determination based on the kind of experience of sampling that you do, and then you make sure you have mechanisms to verify. It becomes a tool when the automation overtakes the value of the intervention, right? Once that happens, then you've got some level of efficiency. If the intervention and validation is more of an effort than setting up automation, then you're as well just you're doing it manually as well. So this is the whole dynamic that's happening, right? I think with AI, which is again, there's certain use cases that it's incredibly effective at, and then there's other use cases where it's not, and you really just have to experiment to find the ones that are going to be the most effective for you.
So I'm sorry to rush through the questions. I think we can probably squeeze in a couple more. One of the questions we had was, what frameworks today exist to help ensure organizations understand their use of AI? Any controls that can be put in place? And this attendee said, it seems to me like a more complicated version of the risks faced by bring your own device years ago.
I'm going to, Jonathan mentioned a couple of frameworks earlier on. I'm going to say that actually a lot of your standard risk management frameworks will apply here with a little bit of interpretation. There are, as we mentioned before, NIST is coming out with an AI framework to try and add more specific content. There's a number of organizations, Jonathan even just mentioned that shared assessments as an organization is adding kind of AI specific questions. We've just put out a kind of framework in our platform, again, specifically around understanding different types of it. But look, I still go back to the basics, that this is still a technology, it's a new technology, and I always believe that the law of physics still apply, right? You need to understand what data you have, where is that data, who's using it, how is it being protected, how it's being managed. Some of the other aspects around things like bias and stuff that become more complicated, but from a data security perspective, the fundamental principles of any data security framework will still stand you in good stead.
Yeah, I would say the same. NIST AI Risk Management Framework is a good one. I think the MITRE Atlas framework is also good, both from identifying what those threats look like, what are the mitigations, and then there's other work going on there that I think is important and interesting. And then I think keeping tabs on some of these new regulations. I think you're going to see banking regulations. You're going to see regulations in healthcare that are in some cases are there for certain activities, but are going to be more widely adopted. And I think each country has their own at this point, except for India. And so that'll be an interesting one from a competitive perspective. They've decided not to regulate. And so I think we're going to see a move towards, of data centers and some GPU specifically to go to India to get away from some of this. We'll see the impact of that.
So one last question. I'm going to squeeze in one last one because I think this is interesting. How can an average CISO manage AI usage when budget doesn't allow for a new team?
Yeah, budget's been one of the questions, right? So where do you get budget for new technology? So in some cases, this comes from an emerging technology budget. If that doesn't exist, and there's not kind of one of those budgets available either in the CISO organization or otherwise, then yes, there's got to have to be a sharing of the budget. I think we live in an environment right now where people are trying to do more with less. They're trying to pare down their budgets and drive consolidation. So maybe as part of that consolidation, they can, think about what roles are necessary to get an understanding of this, and then they should put money aside for Cranium. Sorry, that was a shameless plug.
Well, I think the answer can be the same. Look, I think any organization should conduct a risk assessment, and that risk assessment should allow them to identify the benefits and risks of using technology AI. And as I said, if they find AI in the business and they need to remove it, then again, it's going to be based on the risk, and that risk can be quantified. And so I would use the quantification of the risk in the risk assessment to justify the budget. If you go to the board and you basically say, look, this is the potential risk in terms of data loss, this is the potential risk in terms of regulatory fines, this is the potential risk in terms of reputation, and you're able to quantify that from a cost, you can use that to justify. Even if you don't get it justified, you've at least articulated that risk to the board and to the management team, and it's their responsibility to accept that risk or not. But if they want to mitigate that risk, then they need to put the budget aside to do that.
Thanks, both of you. I am so sorry because I know we have other questions that we'd love to be able to answer, but we have run out of time. Thank you so much for attending. That's the end of today's webinar. Thank you to Jonathan for being our guest, our special guest on today's webinar. I'm sure that everybody's learned a lot about AI and how we need to start thinking about it now, if you haven't done already. Please look out for more information on our next webinar in November. You can find information about Ostendio on LinkedIn, and you can schedule your free AI consult with Ostendio by following that link that it was also shared in the chat. I also shared in the chat information about how you can follow Cranium on LinkedIn and also Ostendio on LinkedIn. So thank you everyone for joining us today. It's been a great discussion. Thank you again, Jonathan. Thank you, Grant, and have a great rest of your day.